Today I am welcomed by Senior Lecturer Karl Death at the University of Manchester. His research focuses on environmental politics in Africa with a particular interest in critical and post-colonial approaches. His recent books include The Green State in Africa, Global Justice, The Basics, and many others. But one of the main ones he's done is Critical Environmental Politics, of which I was a student back in 2016, and that was one of the most memorable and enjoyable modules I've ever done. So, Dr. Karl, thank you for coming. Honored to have you on.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So yeah, let's get cracking into it. So, critical environmental politics. Even now, if I approach someone in the street, I'd probably struggle to explain it properly. What is critical environmental politics for a layman, for a standard person on the street? How do you explain it?
Okay, good start. In fact, in that course that you took, and it's lovely to have a former student talk to you again. In that course, we start by discussing and trying to define what each of those terms mean: critical, environmental, and politics, and perhaps that discussion carries on throughout the course, and these are open issues for debate. Let's take them in reversed order then. So politics, and I'm a lecturer in international political economy or international politics. Politics has been traditionally defined in terms of contests over who gets what, when, and how. You can view politics in quite a traditional way in terms of political institutions, so parliaments and elections and parties, or you can view politics as about sort of clashes between different groups in society, social movements, social forces. But politics is also about, as well as these sort of clashes and conflict, it's also about cooperation, and it's also about ideas and values, and ideas about what is right and what is just and what is fair, what is a good life in the spirit of this podcast series, perhaps. So that's broadly politics. Environmental politics is then one specific area within politics in terms of these clashes or different conflicts or different ideas and values over the environment. And the environment is also a tricky term to pin down and define. In one sense, it's just that surrounds us. We're in different environments at the moment, being on Zoom. But environment has usually been held to mean nature or the natural world. I think I definitely in that course, critical environmental politics, I definitely see Manchester, where I live and work and teach. That's cities are also part of our environment, so it's not just sort of national parks and forests and mountains, but it's where we are. But it's the environmental conditions that we live and work and have leisure in. So it's I guess for that, the way I tried to define sort of the starting point for the students this year was that environmental politics is trying to understand processes of conflict and cooperation between humans, but also humans and non-humans trying to live well on this shared and finite planet. And on the course, we make a big argument for the importance of viewing these things critically as well. And there's another set of debates about what critique and critical theory mean.
And how, speaking of being critical and critique, how does thinking of the environment critically and politics critically, how does that enrich our discussion and our daily lives, you could say? Because if we do want to live more sustainably, we want to be better people, and there's a certain narrative maybe the state would have, or in the media is propagated. How does being critical enrich us on a personal perspective?
That's a really good question, and I think those two examples of reactions to the state or government and reactions to the media, I think are really good starting points for thinking about what it means to view the world critically. In one sense, all kind of considered thought and reflection should be critical. critique, viewing the world critically, is a core element of reasoned, rational thought, in which we try to think hard and carefully about the world around us, try to evaluate the things we're told, try to match them up to our own values and beliefs and the evidence of what we see around us. And certainly in the spirit of university education, universities have traditionally been institutions for the promotion of critical thinking and critical theory. And there you get a slightly different or a slightly deeper understanding of the term critical theory, which refers to the traditions of intellectual thought. So in a politics course, when we talk about critical theory, we're usually talking about intellectual traditions, including Marxism, including post-colonialism and post-structuralism. There's what's sometimes called the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, so early 20th century German philosophers, people like Adorno and Horkheimer, Habermas coming on later, but one of the most famous 20th century philosophers associated with critical theory. Feminist traditions, queer theory, some branches of green and ecological theory, critical race theory, those sorts of traditions of critical theorizing. And there are lots of differences between those approaches. What I would say is that what they share is a number of things. Firstly, rather than the sort of classic scientific laboratory style mode of thinking, where you create laboratory conditions and you have an experiment, you control all your variables and you test something again and again and again. Critical theorists who are operating in the realm of usually social sciences, the humanities, place a really strong emphasis on reflexivity, and I think that's why it chimes so well with philosophy and ethics and considerations of morality, because it does ask, well, how does the world look from my perspective, and how might that look different from other people's perspectives? How does our upbringing of values, our background condition the world around us? There might be multiple truths in society rather than one single truth. Some of the other things that those traditions, I think, share in common, and maybe this is one of the more straightforward ways of understanding what critical means. That they're critical of the world around us, in the sense that it appears obvious that the world around us is not working for the majority of people and non-humans who live in it. I mean, the world is a violent, dangerous, unfair, unequal place. For lots of people. Life is comfortable for a very small section of humanity at the moment, and critical theorists say we have to focus resolutely on this. And that question, not just trying to understand and explain the world around us, but the belief that the world could be differently, that we should not just study the world, but also try to act upon the world, try to shape the world in line with our values and our ethics and our morality.
Indeed. And by being critical, we can challenge the current status quo, whether that's government authority or media narratives, which may propagate inequalities and existing injustices, right?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the central concepts in both politics and critical theory is power. It's looking at the ways in which power operates in the society around us, and that's both formal institutions, so it's government and economic, the forces of the market and so on, but it's also ideas and discourses and the way in which truths are packaged and proclaimed. And so understanding the way in which power operates is a core task of critical theory, and also looking for those levers of change, that these structures aren't set in stone, that the world has changed in the past, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse, depending on your perspective, but the world the world around us, our own small worlds, our microcosms, can be changed by our actions, but also larger social changes happen because of people getting involved with politics and power relations around them, whether they are thinking of it in terms of critical theory or not. But certainly critical theorists would argue that change comes from people and large numbers of people, or radically motivated people engaging with the world around them.
And one of the things you mentioned was just power there. I think in your book you mentioned Foucault has this idea of biopower. Could you just delve into that? Because that's not like, maybe people have heard of Marx a lot, but I think very few people have actually heard of Foucault outside academia. And his biopower is quite an interesting concept.
Yeah, certainly. So in my own research, I've relied on the work of Michel Foucault quite a bit. So he was a historian, or a historian of the ideas of thought, of ideology and philosophy in France. Most of his work was published in the 1970s and the 1980s. So he was quite a significant figure at the time within French philosophy and the academy, at a time of huge upheaval in the second half of the century, in Marxist and post-Marxist debates. Foucault's often regarded as a post-Marxist, in that he was quite critical of some forms of structural Marxism, which in some ways for him seemed to close down some of the possibilities for change and for action. And Foucault's often associated with a theorist who focuses more on discourse, on language, on the sort of games that you can play within language, and the various ways in which discourses compete and overlap. And he's a well-known thinker within critical theory and the social sciences, and some of his research has begun to sort of make waves beyond the academy. He did some research on how prisons function to contain and govern criminality, and he did other research on madness and on sexuality, and he's quite an influential theorist in post-colonial terms as well. But he is a theorist of the academy, really. But this concept of biopower you mentioned, he's a very productive thinker who touched on lots of different sorts of debates, and one of the areas he wrote about was perhaps most relevant for thinking about environmental politics, is this concept of biopower, which is really the governance or the power over forms of life. And when he was writing about it, he was thinking mainly in terms of human life, in terms of how forms of human life in their biology, if you like, are governed. So the way in which, at a certain point in history, states and governments started becoming obsessed with data on birth rates, on rates of disease and the transmission of disease from different parts of the kingdom to another, on life expectancy, on death rates, on all these sorts of these features of the sort of basic biological reproduction of the species, how healthy, how productive the population that rulers were ruling over were. And Foucault sees a lot of continuities between the sort of early obsessions of states in the 16th, 17th, 18th century with more contemporary forms of governance, which do stretch into all aspects of our life. He saw the kind of logical conclusion of this governance of life, of biology, as coming in the Nazi death camps of the early 20th century or the mid 20th century, in terms of that fascist governance of the population, that obsession with how healthy and well-being the population is, rather than any concern about individual well-being and liberties and so on. But I think you can also extend his work on biopower, the governance of life, to look at non-human forms of life. So in a way, conservation is a form of biopower. It's an attempt to govern, conserve, protect, look after certain non-human populations, whether those be habitats or giraffes and elephants and rhinos, and thinking about the implications, both the political mechanisms that happens, but also the implications for other political goals, things like democracy or dissent and resistance, distance, individual liberty, those sorts of questions, I think are really interesting. And Foucault was here. He's quite an ambiguous philosopher in a lot of ways, in the sense that he was quite reluctant to say this is wrong and should be opposed. He was more attentive to the dangers in contemporary modes of governance.
Yeah, this is something I found. Well, I struggle with Foucault personally because with other thinkers, like let's say Marx, he critiques capitalism, but he gives you something like, "Hey, this is the solution there." Or let's say with feminist critiques, they've got, okay, this is something wrong with the patriarchy, or whatever. This is the solution now. With Foucault, it was more of, this is the way systems and governments have organized, and they're encroaching power. But I don't know what do we do with that now? Yeah. That's why I struggle with Foucault. Like, what do we do with information? Right?
Yeah, and he was. I mean, a lot of that comes down to he when he commented on questions of liberation, and he said he was quite suspicious of the idea of liberation, which a lot of other critical theorists say this is what we should be aiming for. We should be trying to free ourselves from power structures and attain a more free, liberated form of existence. Whereas Foucault was quite skeptical about this. He thought that, well, there's always going to be different forms of power structure that shape the world around us. And I guess he was writing at a time when some of that early Marxist optimism about the Soviet Union was becoming to be quite heavily qualified, and many people realized that the Soviet Union was not becoming this sort of utopian society of freedom. And so in that sense, he and many intellectuals on the left were becoming quite skeptical of these grand utopian projects that said they were going to deliver freedom. But I think so. Yeah, Foucault is more interested in the kind of micro politics, the ways in which in the places where people live and work, and particularly in the institutions where people live and work. I mean, he was in one way, he's a historian of institutions. He was a historian of the prison, of the asylum, of the school, of the academy. And for him, I think that would be the scale, the site at which you should resist. You should challenge modes of governance, not for any grand overarching aim. Although there are at times where he sort of seems to suggest that there are more oppressive forms of domination, and then there are more relatively free societies. So we should always strive to work out what freedom means in the context in which we live, and that might depend upon the society or the community or the institution we're living in and working in at that moment.
Yeah, that's important, because especially nowadays, like with the example of the government, like as you mentioned in France, they were gathering more and more data. Nowadays, it's a necessity, because one could argue if they want to deliver effective public services like the NHS or public transport system, you need data to improve your services. But then they can also use that data to like nudge economics in that sense, to nudge our behavior in ways which we don't actually realize. So there's two ways of looking at it.
Yeah. No, that's a really good example, and I think a lot of political theorists who are interested in these questions of data and new technologies of governance have been quite influenced by Foucault's critique of the way in which power seems to penetrate all aspects of our society. At times you read Foucault and it is like reading Orwell 1984. Power operates everywhere and it gets into our heads. And I think on the one level you could use Foucault or other critical theorists. I mean, many Marxist theorists are also very useful in terms of thinking about how data about us becomes a commodity that is controlled either by governments or by private corporations. So the data that is on most of our phones or email accounts is not always accessed by governments, although it can be, but it's also in the control of private companies who, for whom it's a source of profit. For Foucault, I think one of the most productive ways in which he would help us think about this is, and productive is an important word here, because for Foucault, power wasn't and it is never simply dominating or repressive. And this is why you can never really escape from power, because it isn't just about these external bad forces like the government and corporations who are oppressing us and constraining our individuality. In fact, he sees our very sense of self, our notion of individuality, of who we are as autonomous individuals in 21st century life, as being bound up with these broader structures and discourses of power. And so I mean, for many of us, our identity is really tightly bound up by devices like our phones, by the forms of data that surround us, by our music preferences and our social media accounts and our networks of friends. And these forms of data aren't just a means of controlling us, they're also a way in which people do express their identity and their individuality. And for many people derive huge amounts of pleasure from this as well. And I think that's really key for Foucault, because if power was just all the time oppressing and repressing us, then no one would buy into it. But power also helps us articulate a certain version of ourselves, and this is why some of these forms of power have proven so durable over time.
Yeah, we can't really avoid power. Parents have power over their children, but that's for good reason. And we lend governments power because to organize our society in an efficient way and to remove chaos, because anarchy would be terrible. So we want someone to have power and enforce a healthy way of living.
The other example that Foucault uses that I like to use in the classroom is the school or the university. There are different forms of power that operate within a school and university. The teachers have certain power over pupils. The educational apparatus have structure our thought in certain ways. There is in contemporary higher education in the UK, there is also a commodified neoliberal element of that as well. Higher education involves making money for some people. It's also bound up with reproduction of the workforce and economic growth and these sorts of things. But neither I nor I think Foucault would say, well, that means that we should get rid of schools and universities then. I mean, clearly these forms of power relation have been immensely productive in other sorts of ways as well.
Indeed. I think we can talk about Foucault for ages, but I want to move on to Karl Marx and maybe Karl Polanyi as well regarding commodification, because this is a term that I think is used quite a lot in academia as well now. And it's an interesting concept, this idea of commodification, and Marx uses commodity fetishism in capitalism. Could you talk a bit about that? What is commodity fetishism, and what are the consequences of commodification? How is our life impacted by this idea of commodification?
There's a big questions and concepts we're wrestling with here, but I think I'll try and bring this around in relation to my own work on environmental politics, because I think commodification is really important for understanding some contemporary dynamics in environmental politics and climate change politics, for example, as well. And I would preface this as well by I'm not a specialist in Marx's political theory, although it is a big part of the course we teach on critical environmental politics, and commodities and commodification are a really central element of Marx's political thought. I mean, in fact, they're the primary concept. If anyone reads Marx's big book Capital, Volume 1 opens with a discussion of the commodity, and he says this is the place to understand contemporary capitalism. So, and it's deceptively simple, because we all sort of know what a commodity is. You can walk into a shop or browse Amazon or anywhere else, and there are all these commodities for sale. So that's basically what a commodity is: something that is for sale in the marketplace. The crucial thing in contemporary capitalism is the way in which market exchange is structured around this exchange value of commodities, which has sort of become divorced from any obvious use or use value of those commodities. And in a sense, that's not the primary role of commodities within contemporary capitalism. Commodities exist to turn money into more money in a sort of classical Marxist sense. They're a way to generate profit. And in terms of environmental politics, this means that whereas perhaps at one point in the past, in a farming society, then the foods you ate, the water you were drinking, where you got your wood to build the house, these things were all relatively close to you. You knew whether you were either producing them yourselves or you knew who were producing them, and you could see the consequences of taking too much wood from the forests, for example, or overfishing the lakes. In contemporary capitalism, organized around the exchange of commodities in the marketplace, these links have just become so far distant that most of us have no real idea where or under what conditions the food was grown that produced the lunch that we buy from a supermarket or in a restaurant. The consequences of the electricity that we use on our laptops and to engage in Zoom calls, the environmental impacts of how that electricity is being generated and stored, those are very far distant. The chain of production and consumption are so long that we're quite divorced from the conditions and the consequences of how any of these things are produced. And it also means that all sorts of things can be commodified, including some things that we really think, well, perhaps they shouldn't be commodified in this sort of way. So human labor becomes a commodity that can be traded. Places where people live, I mean, that's one of the main commodities in contemporary society, and people end up losing the place that they live. Land becomes a commodity, and when we talk about environmental politics, then new commodities are being created in order to deal with the effects of climate change, things like carbon credits. So a carbon credit is a right to emit carbon dioxide, and the theory of carbon trading is that if we create a marketplace for these, then this will allow an efficient way of reducing carbon emissions, but it involves commoditizing emissions of carbon dioxide. So these things can be traded on the marketplace and can become a source of profit. And so for someone like Polanyi, these things like labor, the atmosphere, land, these are fictitious commodities, things that aren't really being produced. They're in any sort of fundamental way. They're being commoditized by the work of scientists and economists as a tool, or almost a trick of making them exchangeable or fungible on a marketplace. But this has all sorts of consequences in terms of capitalism also relies on continual growth and maximization of rates of profit and things like that. And for many critical theorists, they would see attempts to try and solve some of the problems that capitalism has caused through economic growth and so on, trying to solve those problems by creating more commodities for exchange in the marketplace as being doomed to failure.
Okay, it is quite a big topic, just hearing you speak about it. But there is one thing which sticks out to me, which is commodification unique to modern capitalism? Because when I think of it, with this definition, surely all of trade throughout history, including the trade along the Silk Road, was also a form of commodification by, let's say, taking, silkworms in China, spinning up silk, and then transporting all across to Alexandria in Egypt. People in Egypt consuming or using that silk were severed from the modes of production in China. So surely that is also commodification, but we don't see that as wrong. Well,
and there is a really important sort of philosophical question here as well as a political question, as a political economic question. So there are, you're right, of course, that forms of commodities have existed throughout human history. As soon as people started to trade, then they were trading in commodities. But so there's a question of scale in terms of the transition to large scale organized capitalism in the 18th and 19th centuries, in the way in which whole economies became organized not around landed power and things like this, but through a new structure of class division in society, basically workers who the commodity they have for sale is their labor time, and capitalists who have the capital to purchase commodities and then sell those commodities for profit and then grow their capital. And so that is a distinctively different economic system, and a global economic system, compared to sort of either barter economies or more mercantile type economies. But there is I think for me there's the really interesting philosophical question here is commodification wrong in some kind of deep and profound sense? And I mean, I would some in the Marxist tradition would say, well, yes, private property is flawed, or even a sin, and that we should be aiming to abolish private property and thereby and commodities in that sense, and really we should value things for their use to us, rather than any value that we can accumulate as a result of them. On the other hand, I think it's probably more. It's probably worth thinking about the sorts of things we think should be commoditized or can be commoditized, and the things that shouldn't be. So, for example, and we still have a contested relationship with the ideas of education and healthcare, for example, being commodified in the UK, and there are different societies have different debates and values around these sorts of things. But the idea that human labor can be fully commoditized, you take that to its logical conclusion, you have the slave trade, and so there are moral economies and forms of morality and norms around the things which can and should be commoditized, and also the laws and the institutions and the norms that surround how they should be exchanged, and that's sometimes, I think that's also sometimes a bit of a misconception around sort of neoliberal capitalism, and that it's anti-rules and authorities. It's just a free-for-all, the market decides, pure economic competition. Whereas any form of economic exchange has to have a set of rules around whether it's just weights and measures or a legal system to protect private property, or take the example of carbon credits. I mean, this is something that does not exist in any obvious way as a commodity, but through a lot of scientific measurement and a lot of economic tools and a lot of legal rules and regulations, you can create a market that didn't exist before. But that needs huge amounts.
Financial derivatives, a lot of
exactly,
just made up and actually just representations of actual commodities.
Yeah, and so they have all sorts of rules and regulations surrounding them, and those are the points at which you can have debates about values as well. And I mean, if we set a much higher price for carbon credits, and said, well, as a society, we value not going down the road of climate catastrophe really highly, and so therefore carbon credits are going to be incredibly valuable, and firms have to pay a huge amount of money to admit any pollution. Well, then maybe, and if that was rigorously enforced, maybe that would involve quite rapid solutions to climate change at the moment. Carbon prices are so low that they're not really functioning in any effective way.
Yeah, like for me, I personally I align, I think, more with Karl Polanyi with fictitious commodities, because Marx seems to say anything that you can put a price on becomes a commodity, but some things are naturally traded anyway. Like maybe I grow apples in my garden and someone else grows potatoes, and we can trade. That seems fairly normal and fairly fair as well. But I feel like the issue comes about with, as we just mentioned, these fictitious things that you wouldn't ordinarily expect to be traded, like carbon credits, like inventing a commodity out of thin air, or even nowadays with debt, so mortgages and things like that, and which caused a financial crisis and caused ruin for millions of people across the world. Just inventing these fictitious commodities, leveraging them so much, and crippling economies. Yeah. Yeah, that's my take on commodification anyway.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I think there's a really important debate here to be had, and I think one of the contributions that Foucault and Foucault's work, I think there's a number of contributions. One is in terms of the political technologies, the how these things are made into commodities. Foucault's is very good on the how questions, looking at the sort of mechanisms and tools and technologies that enable fictitious commodities to be created, things like financial derivatives and so on. I think ethically and philosophically, Foucault is also maybe quite good on casting a critical eye on the distinction between that sometimes exists in quite a stark way between fact and fiction. That some things are more straightforward and obvious, and other things are more invented or fictitious. Whereas Foucault might encourage us to see the network of discourses and values and performances and rhetoric, and not exactly illusion, because illusion suggests there's a reality standing in counterpoint to that, but the way in which all aspects of life around us are historically produced and could be organized differently in different societies and different times.
I think you touched on market environmentalism, as I say. And I think there's maybe some issues with the idea of profit, because we think of profit as a gain of some kind, but it's only measured numerically in a kind of currency. And what happens with externalities is that we don't take into account these modes of production, with, as you mentioned, in commodification, and we may end up devouring or destroying the resource which actually was used to make that gain in the first place, and then rendering future gains impossible, like soil degradation, over farming soils, and which renders that in the future we just can't farm them anymore and they become desertified. This is probably one of the key aspects of commodification, which affects the environment, right? The soil. In your work in Africa, what things have been happening around, you could say, commodification, or let's say soil degradation, things like that over there?
Interestingly, soil degradation was a huge concern for Marx as well, and the way in which even the time in which he was writing, he could see the degradation of the soil and over consumption of over farming and consumption of the forest, and he saw this as a something fundamental to capitalism, even at that point. And yeah, so there's a number of different ways to take that in terms of African politics and farming and interest in kind of green revolution and things like that in Africa. The country where I've done most of my research is South Africa, and South Africa is an interesting example because of the importance of the land and agriculture and conservation in all sorts of ways to the South African economy. The imperative to transform and redress the form of colonialism and racial apartheid that existed in South Africa, whereby the white population owned the vast majority of land, and the majority of population, the black population, were confined to a very small part of the land. So land and redress of the land, of land ownership, is a huge political issue in South Africa. South Africa there's a lot of very fertile land, and South Africa is famous for exporting fruit and wine and all sorts of other things. And conservation is also a really important part of the South African economy. South Africa is highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and so the large parts of South Africa are already and have historically been desert for a very long period of time, but fears around the encroaching desert and water shortages in South Africa South Africa is very vulnerable to changing levels of rainfall and the effect of that on soil production and soil fertility. And interestingly, in terms of relation to some of the debates we were having around technology and commodification and truth and those biopower, biopolitics, perhaps. And one of the big debates in South Africa over the last 20 years in terms of agriculture has been around genetically modified crops and the use of technology to increase crop yields, but then also the questions of who owns that technology, who has the rights to seeds, the role for smallholder farmers or community level farmers versus big agricultural corporations, and also questions of what is right and moral and ethical in terms of modifying genetic structures of crops and what this means for diseases and human health and pesticides and those sorts of things as well.
Yeah,
I'm not sure if that was a real answer to your question, but those are some things that came to mind.
Something which I think builds on that is the conception of nature, because I feel one of the things in the current discourse, at least, is we talk about, especially in the media nowadays, and we've got the environmental movement, you've got Greta Thunberg and all kinds of organizations now. And it's becoming, I think, having an ESG element of a corporation now is becoming increasingly popular. And I think one of the things which is missed out, and maybe actually, is the conception of nature, because until we actually understand, have an idea of what our conception of nature is, I think we're always going to struggle with what the actual solution are when it comes to climate change. Because if we think of nature solely as a resource, then we'll continue to plunder it and maybe kick the can down the road, which is what capitalism does. How do you navigate that? How do you, like, for instance, as a religious person, right? I believe in God and so on. For me, the narrative is quite clear that, okay, this is God's earth, and therefore I can't do as I please. There are certain boundaries I must respect. But for people who have different values and beliefs, how do we decide on what our relation to nature is, especially if most of the world is now practically no longer spiritual or religious, you could say?
I mean, I think you're right. It is a fundamental question, politically, ethically, intellectually, and that concept of stewardship of the earth, I think, is one of the big contributions that many religious teachings have given the environmental movement about holding the land as or acting as steward over the land rather than owning and exploiting the land. And that has had a big influence on teachings of sustainability and preserving the land and nature for future generations. But you're right. I mean, nature has famously been described as one of the hardest words in the English language to define. And I think people's relationship to environmental politics is fundamentally conditioned by what springs to mind when they think of nature, and that changes over time, and it changes in different places. So, for example, again, to use the example of South Africa, when I did some of my PhD research, and I'd be talking to social justice activists and I was saying that I was interested in environmental politics, and then they kind of roll their eyes and they'd assume I was there to sort of rhino conservation or saving the butterflies, and they say, oh, we've got bigger issues here. We've got living conditions for people, wealth inequality, and then you start talking about the issues that communities are wrestling with, and they're wrestling with access to safe and clean food and water, the living conditions, the conditions of commuting to work, air pollution, all those things that I think a broader definition of the environment, certainly those sort of things are environmental and environmental justice issues. But I think that, and this is actually what some of the research that I'm doing at the moment, because there's no one simple answer to how people's idea of nature comes from. But this question of what sort of world do we imagine ourselves inhabiting in 30, 40 years time, or what sort of world do we imagine our children and our future communities living in? I think that's a really fundamental one for environmental politics. That is part of environmental politics, and for some people there is a one branch of the environmental movement that has traditionally had fairly conservative views about that, in the sense of thinking back to past relationships with nature. So in the UK, perhaps that image of the village and the village green and the river burbling past the thatched cottages, and for some people that is their ideal relationship to nature, sort of small scale settlements and farming, whereas that's maybe quite a Western European idealized image of the relationship between people and nature, whereas in somewhere like South Africa or the United States, their image of nature is on a much bigger scale, and they tend to think in terms of mountains and forests and deserts and the sweeping areas of wilderness. So you've probably heard this before, there's a very famous aphorism that God may be able to create nature, but only Congress can create wilderness. And the first national parks in the world were created by an act of Congress. Governments created areas of wilderness for protection. And so ideas about the sort of ideal relationship in the future to nature or natural areas is very different if you sort of talk to Americans in the Midwest or South Africans than it is if you think about it in the home counties in England, for example. And there are lots of, this is something that in democracies we can and should be able to talk about and exchange views on. There is no sort of right answer that can be opposed here. What sort of natures do we imagine? There are lots of quite heated political debates going on around this at the moment, leaving space for nature and the 30 by 30 movement. But the sort of research I've been doing at the moment is looking at one quite different way of articulating that, and looking at science fiction novels and poetry and films. And there is an emerging body of literature on climate fiction, cli-fi. So science fiction set in near future, but in climate changed futures. And this is one way of looking at how artists or intellectuals or thinkers have imagined different relationships with nature in the future that can perhaps shine a light on some of those things in the present as well.
Okay, that's quite interesting with the climate-fi, as you said. One thing I find interesting about nature is the way and how people view nature is also in mythology. I'm not sure if you heard of Joseph Campbell, his monomyth thing. Effectively, so he wrote this kind of thing where if you look at all the great myths of the past and the great epics and stories, they have this kind of template, which is like you have your hero and he's in the ordinary world. Something happens to him, like he gets taken out of his ordinary world, and he has to rise to the occasion. He has to fight some kind of demon or whatever, go through a challenge, and then he gains a unique ability or something, and then he goes back to the ordinary world and he uses what he's gained and fights some kind of injustice. So you've got Star Wars follows that model. You've got a lot of biblical stories follow that model.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just this idea of nature as being, and often nature, if you look at that, it's the idea of it's like a wilderness, and nature's like something scary. It's something you don't go.
Yeah.
And there's like demons there. Like King Arthur, he fights a dragon in the wilderness. Yoda, he's in the planet of Dagobah, which is like a swampy kind of thing. So the hero has to go to nature, and battle his demons there, and then become strong and come back to the city where humans live, and then deliver justice. I think that's often quite useful, thinking about nature and mythology as well, and how humans have connected to nature in the past.
That's so interesting. And yeah, that sense at which nature was something threatening and dangerous, and then a sort of proving place, somewhere to test yourself again. And you see that element in the kind of North American idea of wilderness as well, that sort of that idea that that heroes should go off and climb mountains or trek through wilderness in order to prove themselves. And I think that that sort of tension between nature and wilderness is something that's either dangerous and scary, or that is exists for humans to prove themselves, or that then needs to be tamed and mastered and controlled and maybe rendered productive and usable. And then that process spawns all these sorts of forms of social angst and societal angst when we realize that we live in societies where there is no obvious nature or wilderness still around. I think this is one reason why people, that's in the UK, that's for example why David Attenborough programs have been so hugely successful. I mean, there is a part of our social and historical mythological brains, perhaps, you like that, even if it's just sitting on our sofa, we like to have this encounter with wilderness, or think that there are still frontiers and spaces of wilderness out there.
And I think this mythological or this idea of wilderness definitely helps counter the commodification kind of nature as a resource. If we have this, like, it's a place of healing, reflection, place to be challenged, and so on. And it can bring so many different things, not just create commodities for us. And it has that place in our world as that.
I think it certainly has that potential. It also, like almost everything, has the potential to be commodified as well, and you only have to look at high-end tourism and conservation tourism for that's exactly the sort of product that they're trying to sell.
Look, we've talked about Foucault, we talked about commodification, talked about wilderness. I think that covers a good amount of critical environmental politics. As a final note, what do you think is probably key for in the current discourse today? What key things should we be critical about and think about a bit more when someone tells us about sustainable or caring for the environment? What do you think there might be behind the scenes, something happening where it's not really so much about helping the environment, it's about progressing another cause behind the scenes?
I mean, that's a good question. I think, I mean, certainly in the last few years, we've, all of us, our relationship to disasters, emergencies, pandemics, and what happens to societies that live through things like COVID-19, how that affects different people in society in different ways, and what community means in those sorts of situations. Excuse me. I think this has led lots of us to think about, well, what's it going to be like living through the various sorts of crises and disasters that a climate change future are going to bring. And I think the intensification of debates around class and gender and race in the last few years are also a really important reflection of how in democracies we need to think about different forms of intersecting identity and how these intersect with power relations as well.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a good note.
Sorry, I've got a tickle in the throat.
It's okay.
No.
I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you for coming on. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. And I've
Thank you
learned
very much, Hamza.